Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 12 of the Yogic Studies podcast. In this episode, we speak with Ruth Westoby, who's a doctoral candidate at SOAS at the University of London. I really enjoyed this conversation with Ruth, getting to know her story and engage with her work more directly. Ruth's going to be teaching an online course for us here at Yogic Studies, as listeners may be aware, on the history of women in yoga. So in this conversation, we got to dive into this course and preview it a bit, as well as just talk more broadly about Ruth's fascinating and important research on the history of women in yoga, gendered language in yogic texts, and really in the Indian traditions more broadly. We look at the yogic body and her research on key terms and concepts like Regis and bindu. We talk about what types of evidence are available for constructing a history of female practitioners, what voices might be elided from a predominantly male and celibate ascetic yoga tradition. I think this is an area of scholarship that has been lacking, and I really appreciate the questions that Ruth brings to these topics, and I'm really excited not only to share this podcast with you, but for her to be offering this new online course. Ruth Westoby is a doctoral candidate at SOAS, University of London, researching for a doctoral thesis on the yogic body in Premodern Sanskrit texts on haṭhayoga, under the supervision of Dr. James Mallinson, as well as offering workshops and lectures at studios and conferences. Ruth teaches on some of the principal teacher training programs in the UK and beyond. She facilitates Yogacampus's online History of Yoga course and serves on the steering committee for the SOAS Center of Yoga Studies. Ruth is also a longtime Ashtanga practitioner. She began to explore yoga practices in 1996 and started to teach postural yoga in 2004. In 2010, she received an MA in Indian religions from SOAS with distinction. In 2016 and 17, Ruth collaborated with the Haṭhayoga project's embodied philology, interpreting postures from the 18th century Haṭha Paddhati, an important textual precursor of modern yoga. This film has been shown as part of the Haṭhayoga project's Embodied Liberation exhibition in 2020 and is something we discuss at the beginning of this podcast. As mentioned previously, Ruth will be offering a new online course for us at Yogic Studies entitled YS 111, Women and Yoga, A History of Female Practitioners. It's a 4-week online course that will run live from October 5th through 30th, 2020. If you're listening to this before October 5th, we extend a warm invitation for you to join us for this fascinating and important course on women in yoga. If you're listening to it after the course has aired, everything will be recorded and enrollment will remain open and the course will be available on demand for self-study. If you'd like more details about the course or to register, you can go to yogicstudies.com/YS-111. All right, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ruth Westoby. All right, I'm here joined by Ruth Westoby. Ruth, thank you so much for joining me and taking this time. It's wonderful to have you here at the Yogic Studies podcast.
Thank you, Seth. So delighted to be invited both to do the podcast and to teach this course for you. I've been checking out the podcast you've already got up, and I'm shocked to be in such esteemed company. I've been loving the podcasts. I think you've got a super model here for reaching out to loads of people across the world. I think that COVID has been such a crazy time. It's hardened our borders, imprisoning us in our homes, and yet it's collapsed so many borders as well. And we've really been able to reach out a bit more. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for saying that. And we're excited to have you teach this course on women in yoga. And I look forward to discussing that with you here today. And it's a bit of a crazy time right now. I'm sitting here in Northern California Thursday morning, and I'm looking out the window here at just this almost apocalyptic orange glow in the sky right now from all of the ash that's been falling from all of the wildfires here. And this is all in the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic. And what has it been, 5-6 months or something now? We're in
Yeah.
this strange space-time continuum. And the beautiful thing of it is going online and dissolving those sort of traditional boundaries, I guess, as you've been saying, and getting to have conversations like this, where I'm in California, and where are you right now? You're outside of London?
Yeah, that's right. It's evening, it's starting to get dark. Yeah, the summer's closing in, winter's on us.
Yeah. So, the beautiful thing is we can tune in, and we can cross these boundaries and have really rich and interesting conversations, and maybe distract ourselves a little bit from the collapse of the world, as it sometimes feels like.
Yeah, I've promised myself not to talk about politics.
Okay, well, we'll leave it at that. We got plenty of great things to discuss, and I think really interesting and important topics for students of yoga history, philosophy, practitioners, and teachers of yoga. I think there's a lot here that is really important to get into. Before we start talking about your research for your PhD at SOAS, and getting into this new online course that you're going to be teaching, I want to talk a little bit about your background and how you got into all this. Now, I think did we first met at that Sanskrit yoga text workshop at SOAS in, I want to say, 2016. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was such a fantastic week-long workshop of reading, many of the Sanskrit texts that are being edited for the Hatha Yoga project, as well as just this team of international scholars of yoga from around the world, and really just diving so deep into the texts and traditions. But it was also unique in that when we read these selections from the Hatha Padati, this 18th century manual on yoga, we had this live demonstration from yourself and another friend and colleague. And
Yeah.
what an incredible way to bring the text alive. This incredibly vigorous, challenging, dynamic sequence of yoga postures from the 18th century. That was quite inspiring, honestly, to watch you kind of reenacting this text. What was that like for you, kind of working with the text, and then, in a certain sense, kind of performing those asanas?
Yeah, it was a fascinating experience. It was a great week. It was a very, very scholarly week. We went to Oxford for part of it. We were at SOAS, and then on the last day, on the Friday morning, we did this demonstration at SOAS, which was incredible because I've never got up in front of the bunch of some of the best Sanskritists in the world and done yoga postures. It's not as bad as doing it in Mysore, I can tell you that.
Yeah, but to do it, to have the learned audience of people like Alexis Sanderson,
Yeah.
Harunaga Isaacson, Jim Mallinson, and so on and so on.
Yeah.
It's a bit of an extra pressure, right,
Yeah.
to do this asana practice. And
Well, me and Aggie did it together. Aggie Gazda demonstrated together, and it was nice to have a bit of backup and
That's right.
do it as a joint thing. Yeah, so I worked on the postures for quite a while for that, and then the next year, the next summer, we filmed all of the sequences. So the 2016 bit, I think we just worked on one of the 6 sequences. So it was really interesting trying to reconstruct a postural practice from written text. Because it's so alien to how you normally practice yoga postures. I mean, I practice Ashtanga yoga in the Patabi Joyce style. So, you're given one posture, practice that for months. It's a very, it's embedded in your body. there's very little oral instruction. You just kind of copy, do, learn it that way. So to be reading text in translation and to look a little bit at the Sanskrit and try and work out what's going on when you don't have that sense of like rhythm and duration and style. And of course you interpret it according to what you know. So I'd read the postures and I'd see postures that I was familiar with. And then we'd get together, particularly when we did the filming the next year. Philippa Asher filmed with us as well. And then we'd get together with Mark Singleton, Jason Birch and Jacqueline Hargreaves and just play around with how we had been interpreting it. And then they'd be like, oh, now we think this. And so it was a really interesting process.
Yeah, that sounds really fun too.
Mm.
But you did have, so you had the Sanskrit text, but then we
Mm.
do have this illustrated Sri Tattva Nidhi that has some illustrations to correspond with it. That must have been helpful as well, to at least have some visual, or at least a representation of the postural forms, yeah?
Yeah, helpful. There's the Sri Tattva Nidhi, the drawings don't have the ground. You can't tell whether they're on the ground or suspended in the air. And that's really difficult to tell from the textual descriptions as well, like what's actually on the ground and what's in the air. And I think Mark and Jason were like, well, basically we've worked out that if it doesn't say it's on the ground, it's not on the ground. If you took that approach to it, you're like, oh my gosh, this just got a lot harder. But one of the fascinating things about it was how hard it was, how physically challenging it was. I think in modern yoga practice, there's definitely a movement towards slowing down and chilling out and sort of stepping away from sort of hypermobility, hyperflexibility, and the kind of push. So it was quite interesting to do something that was audaciously difficult.
Yeah. There's 112 postures, is that right?
Yeah.
And I think for the film that you're talking about, I believe it's true. I remember Jackie and Jason saying this, that, going around the world really and drawing on very advanced asana practitioners, including yourself and many others, including almost asana athletes, if you will, in India, that they were only able to recreate 111 of the 112, that there was one posture that sort of escaped even the most adept asana practitioners. Did you attempt that 112th posture?
I'm not sure which one it was. When we did the filming of it, me, Aggie, and Philippa split the postures up, sort of, back of an envelope sort of thing. And Philippa's got really, really long legs, and Aggie's got a really long torso, and I was somewhere in between. So we were literally just going through working out who could do things best. And Aggie's sort of super athletic, and Philippa's like super bendy. So. So we sort of split them up a little bit before we got to them. And then, of course, because we were speaking with Jackie, Mark and Jason, our interpretations were changing quite a lot. So something that if we had been working on it one way, we were then having to flip it. And I think Philippa was practicing, and it turned out that one of the poses she was due to record was, balancing your chin on your elbows in a back bend with your feet on your head. She was like, oh, I didn't realize it was that one.
Oh, wow. I think the one that they couldn't do, I don't want to misspeak, and I forget the Sanskrit name for it, but it had something to do with hanging upside down with a rope and also holding on to like a weighted dumbbell, maybe even in your mouth.
Yeah. You have to hold the weight of a stone in your mouth.
Yeah. A friend of mine, Chiara, from Italy, who's also very advanced, very strong and flexible asana practitioner. I know they had her try to attempt it several times, and she couldn't quite do it. But that always just stuck out to me, that these are so difficult, some of these postures in this text. There's so much going on there that we could spend this whole podcast actually discussing. But I bring this up to kind of preface your academic work and our first meeting, to kind of highlight that seems like you come into the academic study of yoga from a background of a very strong and dedicated yoga practice. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that background, and then how you came into this world of academic yoga research and to, doing the PhD at SOAS?
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, so I started doing yoga when I was about 16, and I went along to class with my mum. We went to class together, and I hated sport at school. I just couldn't bear to sort of be in front of other people. So I really enjoyed doing yoga when I was 16, and then sort of did it on and off. Moved to London to do my undergraduate degree, which was history and international relations, so not really this field, and kept doing yoga on and off. I remember doing one Ashtanga class. I didn't know it was Ashtanga when I was at university. I was like, whoa, man, that was so difficult. I'd ache for 2 weeks, and then I'd be like, I'm going to try that one again.
Was this in the UK, I guess?
Yeah, just a random studio in North London. And then after my first degree, I worked in like lobbying and activism for a while, and started practicing Ashtanga yoga at Ashtanga Yoga London with Hamish Hendry. So I guess he is my main teacher over all these years. I started, I did a couple of teacher trainings, a couple of 200-hour courses. And I think it was in 2007 that I gave up my kind of proper job and became a yoga teacher and started going to Mysore. So did a few trips to Mysore, eked out a living teaching postural yoga classes. I did an MA at SOAS in Indian religions. Now they have the MA in traditions of yoga and meditation, but at that time they didn't. So I did Indian religions. It was fantastic. Just such brilliant modules. I had Tadeusz Skorupski teaching Indian Buddhism, Theodore Preferis on like classical Indian philosophy, Brian Black on, we did text and context in classical Hinduism. So just some fantastic courses were on offer at the time.
Your time in Mysore and really your commitment to the practice of yoga and spending time in India, that sort of inspired you to want to go on to actually do a graduate degree, would you say?
I'm not sure if it was just practicing in India.
Where did the idea come from to then go back to school and to do the MA?
I love studying. Like I'm never happier than sort of stuck behind a book, not having to talk to people. So I'm desperately pretending right now that it's just you and me, Seth, and nobody else is out there.
It's just the two of us.
Yeah. So I just couldn't be more happier sitting shuttered away behind a book. And I've always wanted to go on and do further study, but not known exactly what was right. And I didn't want to just do anything. When I was doing yoga teacher training courses, it was always the history and philosophy stuff that really got me going, that I found really exciting, and that gave the depth and the breadth and the reason to doing the physical postures for doing meditation. Like I could never have got into, say, running or something as much because it didn't have this kind of depth to it. So I've always been drawn to those parts of it. And I guess I wanted to diversify a little from just teaching postural classes. Wasn't sure whether that would be something I could keep up for an entire career, really.
Okay, so you did the MA, and that was before the yoga MA program at SOAS existed.
Yeah. I did a dissertation on Ishvara in the Yoga Sutra. So when you were talking to Philip Mars and you had that chat, I was like, ooh. Brought back a few memories.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I wonder, are you familiar with Jonathan Dickstein's work on Ishvara? He did an MA on Ishvara in the Yoga Sutra as well.
No, I'm not familiar with it. I should make a little note.
I think he hasn't published it yet. But it's always, for me, been such a fascinating part of the Patanjali yoga tradition, and something there's been so much debate about that. It's always been a very, very interesting part of the text. But let's keep going before otherwise I'll get too enwrapped in the Ishvara question. But I didn't realize you did your MA on that. That's great. That's a great just problem to dig into and to really focus on, and it requires you to study so many other aspects of the Indian traditions, right? To bring that into context.
Yeah, so I finished that in 2010, and then I started doing Sanskrit. So I didn't do Sanskrit as part of my MA because everyone said it was too terrible, it was too difficult, it would really ruin the rest of your MA.
It would just
So
ruin you.
it would ruin you. So I thought, okay, I want to enjoy the history of and the ideas, because I just find all of that so appealing. So yeah, I didn't do Sanskrit as part of that. And then after the MA, I started doing evening classes in Sanskrit and just gradually built it through different courses, and I'm still very much working on it. So you've got Antonia Rupel teaching for you, and I love her stuff. So I'm
Yeah,
taking
she's
myself
great.
back through the textbook. So big shout out to Antonia.
Yeah. Her book is great, and she's a great teacher. We're very
Yeah.
lucky to have Antonia. Hi, Antonia, if you're listening. Good. Okay. So you finished the MA. You then dove into the Sanskrit despite warnings to your personhood.
Yeah.
And you persevered. And then were you still teaching yoga as well on the side at that time?
Yeah, still teaching, and parenting. So learning Sanskrit was my antidote to
Yeah.
parenting.
Yeah. Yeah. Those are two full-time jobs.
Yeah, quite
I
contradictory
know.
ones at that.
Yes, I know quite well. Well, then you did carry along, and yoga studies really started to take off at SOAS with the arrival of Jim Mallinson, and then, well, I guess even before that, the MA in Yoga and
Yeah.
Meditations program. But I mean, now it's just booming there, and now you are enrolled and working on a PhD at SOAS. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, it was partly inspired by the scholars working on the Hatha Yoga project, by Daniela, Jim, Mark, Jason, and just finding their work so fascinating and seeing that as a really interesting place to work. And I'd already done my MA there, so I knew that that was the right institution for me. And I lived quite locally to SOAS. So it was then coming up with the research project, really. And yeah, funnily enough, I was on a flight to India years ago, reading the Hatha Pradipika and reading the Vidroli section, just kind of thinking, this is pretty weird. What's going on? And then, yeah, all these years later, spending a lot more time reading the same sort of texts.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Well,
kind of.
and I think the reason you're saying that is because these sections in these texts, like the Haṭha Pradipika, that teach Vajroli mudra, this sort of urethral section, suction. Sorry. There's some of the few references to female practitioners that we find in these Sanskrit texts. Is that right?
Yeah.
And that's what
Yeah.
piqued you?
Yeah. So I was very interested in where are the women in these sources, and of course they're not there. They're in the Hatha corpus. There's plenty of kind of misogynist dismissal of women as impedimenting the male practitioner's path. But little to say about women, whether women can practice. So going in through that particular practice, if you look at the practice of Vidroli, that is a practice in which women do occur, either usually as a sexual partner for a male practitioner. But then we also have these statements that women can practice it and can be successful in it. So I guess with the overall research project, I wanted to look at women, I wanted to look at gender. There isn't really enough material just in the Hatha sources to write a whole PhD on women because, yeah, in a nutshell, I've already said it.
Right.
So it evolved into looking at how gender is used as an organizing principle in the yogic body. And I suppose it's evolved a little bit on from that. So I'm not just looking at gender, but all of the paradigms of the yogic body and whether and to what extent they're using like dualisms, dichotomies, also deities, how oppositions are used for their contrastive value, but then often sublimated into one thing. So yeah, it's it's looking at the philosophy and the ideas, and then grounding that in the body and saying, okay, but in the body, how does this all come together? Let's look at the body as a site, as a nexus for, and I think that this is what Hatha yoga does in a phenomenal way. It's bodily practices. So how is gender coming into play there? How is it being used?
Yeah, when I'm teaching, especially more publicly, let's say in a yoga teacher training context or something like that, uh, I'm constantly aware, and feel like I've repeated this so many times, but like one of the starkest differences that we see between what folks like you and I are studying in these pre-modern yoga traditions in India, the difference between the pre-modern yoga and the modern contemporary, postural yoga traditions that we see. I mean, one of the starkest contrasts is who's doing the yoga, right?
Yeah,
Today, we just know, for anybody who's stuck their head inside a yoga class in the last, decade, that it's
yeah,
predominantly women. I think
yeah.
the Yoga Journal, demographic surveys say something like 75% female practitioners.
Mm.
And it's almost the complete opposite, totally inverted from what we see in the pre-modern sources.
Yeah.
And so when looking at the past, as you're doing, I want to just kind of highlight one of the things you said is, one of the first places we might look, right, is these Sanskrit yoga texts. And
Mm.
we do have references to women, but they're sort of fleeting, right? They're kind of on the periphery of these texts. Can you
Yeah.
say just a little bit more about that, and how do you understand these references to women? And maybe we can look at a couple examples from the Hatha yoga corpus of texts. What can we say about the role of women in medieval Hatha yoga?
So, when we're looking at the Hatha corpus isn't for women. It isn't about women. It's written by men for men, about men. It's preserved within a male recension textual history. So the scribes, the copyists, and men. Those are the concerns that they're talking to. And so within the Hatha corpus, looking from the Amrita Siddhi 11th century onwards, we just get, absolutely fleeting references to women. Women are often listed amongst the three things one should avoid in the early stages of practice: travel, fire, and women. Injurious, they're obstacles, they'll impede your path of yoga.
Mm.
And then, but that usually just applies in the early stages of the practice. And then towards the end of your practice, you can have sex with as many women as you want because you're established in your practice. So one of the sort of esoteric, if you like, models for the yogic body is the preservation of bindu being semen or amrit, so sort of immortality. The idea being that this is not necessarily an ontologically, medically real fluid that is physically there necessarily, because it sort of is slightly more, I tend to say it's sort of abstracted from an ontologically real thing. The idea is it drips down. This is really clearly set out in the Amrita Siddhi, that the bindu drops down, and if it goes out of if it's burnt up in the fire of the belly or emitted out into the world through procreation, that is, life for future beings, but death for the yogi.
And hence bindu dharana, the retention of bindu, or celibacy, right? Like
Yeah. Yes.
retaining that vital life force in men, though, right?
Yeah.
Right. And so sometimes I think this is somewhat disappointing for women students of the yoga tradition, right? Who
Yeah.
are looking back at these, authoritative yoga texts and scriptures, and sort of not seeing themselves represented
Yeah.
at all in these texts. Has that been your experience?
Yeah. So one of the things that I'll try to pick apart a little bit in the first module for the course that I'm going to teach for you is like, sort of why we're studying. Why do we want to look at this material? If we have an agenda, then it's worth thinking about that a little bit and trying to expose it. And often what we want to see is, like, I want to see strong female characters who are presenting a version of the world that I can admire and live up to. And I want to be able to do a strong yoga practice, but there are no female role models within the tradition necessarily that I can see doing that. So I think we need to pick apart why we're looking at this stuff. Are we trying to somehow free the yogini? Are we trying to, like, give her a subjectivity and autonomy and agency? Because that's a real dangerous project. And for example, I think Miranda Shaw was trying to do that a little bit in the Buddhist canon.
Yeah.
So it's tricky, because within the Hatha sources, there's just so much that they say and not more. But that doesn't mean to say that there weren't female practitioners. I mean, in the course I'm going to teach for you, we're going to look real wide, and we're going to pitch the historical range really early. But if we just look at the Hatha sources, that doesn't mean to say that women weren't practicing, but they were just on the margins, perhaps. So they, if funding is going to the monastery, it doesn't mean to say there isn't a nunnery next door, but they perhaps aren't producing texts and recording teachings in the same way. So it's about, and I guess this is a slightly sort of political point, it's about types of knowledge, and what knowledge is privileged, what knowledge is preserved. So we tend to attribute great authority to the written word. We tend to attribute authority to the Sanskrit language rather than vernaculars.
Yeah.
So the areas in which women are operating are excluded, are erased, if those are the only sources that we're looking at. So to find women's voices, to find women's practices, you have to widen your sources, which actually isn't something that I can do too much in my own research projects, because I don't have vernacular languages. So I'll just have to do what I can.
But we can look at, and we'll get to this, I think, in a little bit, some of the paintings and maybe some of the visual material, like during the Mughal period, we do have some depictions of female ascetics and yoginis there, which maybe we can discuss in a little bit. I do want to sort of run something by you. What I've always felt in reading these texts is that absolutely, like you said, they're sort of by men, for men, pitching predominantly this male, celibate, and very ascetic culture of yoga. Even if we can find exceptions within that, that's sort of the general model of the production of these texts. And the audience of these texts, place the left heel underneath the penis. Well, it's pretty obvious, what the prototype body is that we're working with here. And yet, within the sort of male gaze of, this Sanskritic ascetic tradition, we do have these fleeting references, like in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, where it says that a man should strive to find a woman who's devoted to the practice of yoga, yoga-abhyasa.
Yeah.
And, we might write that off and we might say, okay, this is just another thing in the service of the male practitioner, right? But on the other hand, it is acknowledging then, if we do take that as descriptive of the social reality of, 12th, 13th century, it is suggestive that there are then female practitioners. There are those who are women who are devoted to the practice of yoga. And so it does seem like, although it's on the periphery of the text, it's not the purpose of the text, it perhaps is pointing towards a social reality where there were women practitioners.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have to say that just because they're not in the text doesn't mean to say that it's not happening, but that's just not the focus of the text. And that's not the text's fault. That's just what the text is doing is something different perhaps than what we want it to be doing. Gosh, there were some really interesting things within what you said there. It was very funny when we did the reconstruction of the Haṭhayoga Paddhati, because at one point you have to tuck your penis in between your legs. We were like,
Right.
That
Skip
sounds a
that
bit
part.
heavy. Yeah, but absolutely, it's all masculine anatomical references. But like interestingly, the word yoni, so sort of womb, is used in relation to men.
Right. But it's
So
not what we think.
yeah, it's the kind of perineal region.
Right.
Yeah, I think something interesting about the text is it's not necessarily talking to a celibate practitioner group. It can be householder group, which is interesting for the practice of Hudroli, because the Amrita Siddhi, this earliest text, is a male celibate context, and the practitioner is told to draw up his bindu and his rajas being the female equivalent of bindu. So I mean, I think we'll probably go on to talk about Regis a little bit more. But the idea there is that within a man, you do have both the male and the female seeds or aspects of the seed. And then there are practitioners who are practicing sexual yoga where there is a woman involved in the practice. And yeah, that's where you get these descriptions of women who are adept at the practice of yoga, who know the yoga shastras. So it is difficult in that context to work out whether they are women who are doing the same practices as men for the same purposes of men, or whether they are conforming to perhaps a more consort type role where they're serving the purposes of the male practitioner. But we are told, so that passage in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra that you mentioned, it has a very similar and extended discussion in the Haṭha Pradipika, and the Jyotsna, the 17th century commentary on the Haṭha Pradipika, extends on that even further, saying that women can practice Vajroli. They should draw up their own rajas. Rajas is sort of, it could be menstrual fluid, it could be female sexual fluid. So they should draw it up and preserve it. And if they do, if she does that, she is a yogini and she acquires the siddhi or the perfection of Khetari, so flying, which, whether that means literal flight or whether that's a type of, as in like an illustrative type of acquirement that can be attained, or whether it's more sort of metaphorical. The question is around whether these references to women are women doing the same practice for the same purposes of men. And Daniela Bevilacqua, who you've also interviewed for this series, she says that nowadays female yoga practitioners are not called yoginis, they're called sadhvis. So I mean, it's very difficult to sort of read ethnographical sources back in time, because it's hard to be sure that the terminology is not changing. But it's a really interesting and perplexing area. In the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, it's said that the male yogin should find the two things that he needs for this practice: milk and a woman who is under his control or is under her own control. It's a very interesting turn of phrase. So and in sort of marriage terms, it can be that she's not under the control of a father or a husband. So does that mean she's more susceptible to kind of being picked up for other types of relationships, or does it mean that she is affirming her own independence and making her own choices about relationships that she enters into?
Right.
So much to pick apart.
And it says it's which is very difficult to obtain, right?
Yeah.
It's a strange passage. And then we get a different version of it in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, where it says the yoga needs milk and angirasa, right? And in your article, which we'll get into here in a little bit, you unpack that further. It does suggest to me there was definitely some fiddling around with those texts and those passages. I think with these different variants of that pair.
Yeah.
So maybe this can kind of segue us into talking about bodily fluids,
Okay.
and this really interesting. This important terminology, bindu and rajas, and thinking about your broader work on the yogic body and the gendered language. This is something that I think has been overlooked, perhaps in in yoga, it's also something it's quite complicated because we see these different models of the yogic body, right, across these different texts. And so it's hard to sort of make sense of holistically. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but this forthcoming article that you have, which you were kind enough to send a draft to me, is called Raising Rajas in Hatha Yoga and Beyond. And you do us the great service of trying to present a summary of this important concept of rajas, not only in the Hatha Yoga corpus, but also looking into Ayurvedic texts, and even looking at some intriguing potential parallels with Taoism and Taoist texts. So
Mm.
I think students of yoga, particularly Hatha Yoga, will be familiar with these terms bindu and rajas, but maybe you can kind of explain a little bit in as simple terms as possible, and then we can get into more detail. Um, what is rajas? How does it relate to this concept of bindu?
Yeah. So I guess I should explain where I was coming from in that article, and which reflects what I'll try and do in the course for you, which is to take to start off from looking at women and women's fluids. I think so much excellent work, of course, has been done on bindu and male practitioners. So it's just I just want to shift the perspective, the position from which we're looking a little bit. So I wanted to look at rajas as it occurs, whether in a male or a female practitioner, to sort of start that shift in perspective. So rajas means red. It means blood. It has many meanings that I'm impressed if you read the article, because it's really dense. I don't think it's very well written,
No, it was
but it
great.
covers a lot of stuff.
Yeah, it's
so
just my kind of article.
Yeah, if you want to go to sleep, then it's one to look at. Yeah, I spent a lot of time with the Ayurvedic sources trying to really define it. Like, is it female sexual fluid? Is it menstrual blood? If it's menstrual blood, from what part of the cycle is it called rajas, and then when does it become a different type of blood? So it's usually the first 4 days of the flow, essentially, are the rajas, which and this is, of course, is connected to purity and impurity. So this is impure flow, impure blood, which you know, in Hindu society, you should not come into contact with this. Did I think I talked about the Brahmahatya myth within the article, which Lydia brought to my attention. So it's really fascinating for a kind of Vedic Upanishadic take on why women menstruate, and it's about sin, and it's a way of purging the sin of Brahma for Brahminicide. Sorry, I'm going off on many tangents already. So you were saying,
No,
what
that's
is
okay.
rajas?
No, that's really interesting. Yeah, you do. I think it's from the Taittiriya Samhita, this origin myth for menstruation. It is important to locate that because, right, this idea of bodily fluids and these terms, they have a much larger sort of cultural life beyond yoga, just within the Indian subcontinent and Indian culture, and things that would have filtered down into yoga traditions. But maybe we can just start. Let me try to preface this a little bit better. I think, in yoga, anybody who studied the Hatha yoga literature, they'll be familiar even more so with this concept of bindu, this notion of, which can be translated literally as semen, but also more abstractly. And we can talk about this weird dichotomy of, like, something that's has an ontological reality within the body, that's something perhaps more gross or even more subtle, but then there's something sort of more abstract, something more energetic, this sort of vital life force essence. But this notion that there's this bindu that resides within the human body, but in particular within the male body, as semen, located in the crown of the head, that is to be maintained, preserved, and even drunk as nectar, and associated then with soteriological states of immortality, of liberation, that really kind of takes on this rich life within yogic literature. And oftentimes it'll be stated that Rajas may or may not be the female equivalent to bindu. But often we'll see, there's this uncertainty, right, of how to translate this term rajas and what does it refer to, right? Because sometimes we see that both bindu and rajas are located within the male body. And at other times it seems like it's something that needs to be extracted from a female body and then mixed and internalized within a male body. And you do a really great job of unpacking all of that in the article. But I think the other thing that you do is you highlight, I think we need to also understand Rajas not just as this correlate to Bindu, but that it actually has sort of its own independence, right, as a term and concept. So I'm not sure if I articulated a clear question in there for you, but so how do we understand Rajas within, let's kind of go back to the yoga corpus in the text. What do you think is going on there with Regis?
So I was really interested to see how can Regis be cited in a male practitioner? What's happening there? So that so for the celibate Hatha yoga texts, you're not going to be doing sexual ritual to acquire the products of Rajas from a woman. So that was part of why I needed to look through all the Ayurvedic material, and I spent a lot of time reading material from Rahul Peter Das. He's got a huge tome called The Origins of the Life of the Human or something. So trying to work out how that's working in a male body, and then of course, because we also have within the texts that there are women practitioners, well, that's kind of easier to understand if we're taking quite well, I think this is where perspective comes into it, because what are we seeing this as? And you've already referred to this as, is it an ontological substance that you can collect in a jar and move around, or is it something much more abstract and energetic? And I think that's where Cartesian dualism collapses. So one thing that I'm really, really interested in doing is trying to expose the frames through which we are looking at this material. And coming from where we are in time and culture, I am going to be quite wedded to Cartesian dualism, whether I want to or not. So this idea that the body and the mind are somehow separate. Even if that's not quite what René Descartes was arguing, that's what his sort of doctrine has been taken as. And because we have that in our background, then when we come to look at these texts, there's a tendency to do that to the text, to try and work out what is the body, what is the mind. And when we have these categories collapsing into one another, it's really confusing, because we don't have a framework, we don't have a language necessarily to communicate with about what is happening in the yogic body. And the yogic body is this kind of esoteric map or paradigm that sort of is written over the physical body to a certain extent, but it is also the physical body, and physical manipulative techniques are effective in shifting the yogic body. So we can look at it in terms of a history of ideas and say, well, sort of derived from Vajrayana and from Shaivism, and looking at how yogic bodies operate there, we can see how that has been brought into Hatha yoga. I mean, I don't have any sort of firm, definitive answers, and I think I'm still searching for the right terminology to talk about these things.
No, those are really important methodological points, though. Sometimes we're sort of we're stuck by our own blinders, the lenses that we're using to look at it, trying to fit something into, a different epistemological lens that might not have been held by the authors of these texts or the practitioners of these traditions. So we need to tread very carefully there.
And I think that has practical kind of translation implications. It does make it very difficult. You have to be very careful and very precise. I mean, part of my project is not necessarily to produce my own translations. Luckily, I'm able to use and some of the fantastic critical editions that have been produced by the Hatha Yoga project. So yeah, I'm not going to be kind of producing big translations as part of this, but looking very carefully at the terminology that's used and trying to unpick what precisely is being expressed by that. So I mean, you were asking, so with bindu is semen, elixir, the stuff of life, which is either this kind of ontologically real thing or this much more refined, subtle concept that, but yet still may have some kind of real ontological existence within the head. And of course, James Mallinson did his doctoral thesis on the Khichri Vidya, so he's looked at this area in huge amounts of detail. And there are different practices that you can do for preserving bindu in the head. Khichri is one of them, but there's also Viparita Karani, so inverting. So I'm not kind of interested in the whole range of practices, but it was more in just the Vidroli one, because that's where we see women practitioners. And
can I pause you right there? A question I often get, and I'd love to just put it to you, is then, so if you're teaching this at a yoga teacher training full of 90% female teachers, the question always arises, for the women in the room, then should they stand on their heads to preserve their bindu?
Oh, that's an interesting question.
How would the texts, like in your understanding of the esoteric body of the female practitioner, do you think the tradition understands,
I don't think the tradition is telling us. From my understanding of the texts, I wouldn't kind of be able to give an answer to that one. And I guess because we're the question, to answer the question, we have to decide whether we're going to say the female body is the same as the male body, like the same practices would have the same effects on the female body. And that's actually a choice that we're making about what we believe male and female body to be. Is it one sex? Is it that's just been split in a few ways, or are they intrinsically different? There are so many debates around that. So I think I would definitely avoid that question. But what the article that I put together goes on to argue is that women are told to draw up their own rajas and preserve it, and by doing so they become a yogini. So that's the only practice that they're given, and they're not sort of told particularly how to do that.
You mentioned that from a history of ideas perspective, we can kind of look back at the tantric materials, Vajrayana and Shaiva traditions. And there, when we look at, the role, the important role of male and female sexual fluids, right? There's quite a bit of discussion, right? And someone like David Gordon White has written extensively, about this. And it's absolutely central to some of the ritual practices, especially in some of the more transgressive non-dual tantric traditions, that there really is this ontological, physical exchange of bodily fluids that then is often, offered, to a goddess or yogini as a form of appeasement, as the kind of the culmination of a ritual, and definitely then involving a type of sexual consort practice. But that's not the type of practice that we see in the Hatha yoga corpus. And, a lot has been written about this, about how there's clearly a major shift in yogic practice kind of interiorizing perhaps some of that outer ritual and some of that language of external ritual, and this sort of interiorization and mapping onto the yogic body. And so, I wonder if there's certain moments in a text like the Haṭha Pradipika where it seems as if those principles of Rajas and Bindu, which may have existed in a more ontological, external, physical, ritual context involving a sexual rite of a male and female practitioner, that perhaps those are being interiorized within the single body of perhaps a male practitioner.
Absolutely. I agree totally with you that I think that that's what is going on.
Yeah, but there's certain verses that are a little bit ambiguous about that, right? And you highlight this in the article, and it's quite clear when you look at different translations of these verses on Vajroli Mudra, like for example the Kaivalya Dhamma edition. They've definitely opted for those sort of readings of these verses where, and they even have notes. I was just looking in it earlier today, which is, this very clearly does not involve any sex at all. This is all taking place within within the one human body, and they're almost sort of embarrassed by the thought of that.
So yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think that that's all very true, that you're taking sort of prior existing absolutely physical practices and rituals and then interiorizing it. But what's fascinating is how that interiorization is not entirely sort of meditative and visualized. The sort of central tenet of the Hatha sources is that they are involving physical practices. So yes, it's interiorized. This gendered dialectic is interiorized within the single body of the practitioner, but it's not completely abstract. It's still considered to be something that has a level of physical grossness, and that will respond to physical manipulations through mudra, bandha, asana, pranayama.
Yeah.
Although later within the same text, that can be much more, these become much more meditative techniques, for example, in the Haṭha Pradipika. So it's not just physical things, which I think is kind of at the crux of this problem with wanting things to be mind or body, and whether we have a way of speaking about them as a single unitary structure perhaps, or can we bring in other aspects of this like emotion, affect, how do we talk about desire, power, these other aspects of the yogic body?
Yeah, because I don't think these traditions had that problem. To be clear, I think that's sort of maybe a modern and Western problem. We constantly see these dyads or triads between chitta and prana, or chitta, prana, and bindu, and this notion of nirodhaing, kind of stilling or restraining one of them in order to, still, control, and restrain the other. That's really a constant thread within yoga traditions broadly. I mean, going all the way back to the Upanishads. I like the caution that you're bringing to, honestly, because we need to give more attention to the language in which we're using to translate and describe what we're sort of fumbling with the words to call this subtle, esoteric, yogic physiology, anatomy. We kind of don't really have the terms to grasp this continuum of a physical and subtle physical reality within the body, because it's absolutely the case, as you're pointing out, that it is through using these gross and physical methods of Hatha yoga, and that's really what's central to Hatha yoga, is kind of using those more physical methods to manipulate and to control and master these more subtle aspects really of Prakriti, we might say, of
Yeah,
materiality.
and these sort of dualities within the body that are gestured to with words like Regis and Bindu, and that are characterized in different ways as having different attributes. I think there's a playfulness with that as well within the sources. And I love the work of Sondra Hausner, who's looked at, she talks about the yogini in Istvan Kuhl's edited volume. And she's talking about how the dualism is flipped. So on the Indian subcontinent, Purusha and Prakriti is the female, Purusha is the sentient understanding. But if you, so Purusha, inactive male, cosmic, not cosmic, what am I talking about? The consciousness, Prakriti being phenomenal material nature, the experience of being alive, of change. And then if you look at the Tibetan plateau, they flip this. So upaya and karuna, or prajna, are the same. It's the same dualism, but it's flipped to the other side. So the female prajna is the inactive perfection of understanding, but the masculine is the means in the world, the activeness in the world that doesn't have that correlate of wisdom attached to it. So yeah, I think that we're looking for this precision in how we interpret and understand the text, and also acknowledge the playfulness that we may be encountering there, and the myriad of models and accounts that are preserved just within the quite small Hatha yoga canon. So we're not going to find a single unified theory at all.
Yes.
So it's more sort of mapping the different accounts and looking at how they work. So yeah, I mean, something that I need to do in my work is to get onto Kundalini and
Now, if we moving a little bit more broadly, and thinking about some of the other topics that you'll be touching on in this course, I think it's definitely true if we're only looking at this medieval Sanskrit Hatha yoga corpus of texts, we're going to be pretty limited in terms of what evidence we have, even if it's pretty interesting and provocative mentions. We're just going to be limited. So if we expand our gaze, we can start to look at other types of materials. Of course, you mentioned, non-Sanskritic texts, vernacular works, but we can also look to things like paintings, perhaps sculpture. Although I think we're quite a bit limited there. I'm trying to rack my brain for, female yoginis in sculpture. Of course, we have, as I say that, there is this important difference, right, between sort of female divinities called yoginis, which we do have in sculptural form, and that kind of murtis of, and then human female, women yoginis. Maybe we can touch on that a bit. I'm sure that'll be something that you cover in the course.
That's definitely something to pick apart. Like, what is a woman? What is a god? What is a yogini?
Well, let me ask you that, since I brought that up. What is a yogini?
Well, I think that the term works really well when we look at some of the areas, some of the layers of text before the Hatha corpus. Obviously there are some fantastic scholars who've done really interesting research on what is a yogini. You talked about the work of David Gordon White. Shaman Hatley as well has looked at this, looked at yoginis and started to pull apart the various distinguishing characteristics. So a yogini is usually a female character, not necessarily human, who has the power of flight, who may take the form of animals. And particularly in tantric literature, the yoginis are very powerful figures who are to be supplicated by the male aspirant for their power, for their spiritual power. So they're occupying quite a liminal position, quite an edgy position in terms of, are these real real women? Are these that they're not quite goddesses? They're not the kind of big gods like Durga, Kali, Chamunda. That and so yoginis, similar to dakinis, are appearing in groups. And then I think largely because of the term yogini, we assume that they have some similarity to hatha yoginis, which I don't think is necessarily the case. Just because the term yogini is used doesn't mean that there's a correlation there to practices of yoga. Olga Sabeva has written on this a little bit, and she's saying very, very firmly that there's no necessary connection there. Yeah, I mean, in the course, what I'd like to do is take a really long historical perspective and look at how sort of piece it together with anecdotal accounts of the lives of women who have had extraordinary spiritual or religious or philosophical capacities that in some way relate to yoga.
Yeah, because if we go all the way back, to the Vedic materials, to the Upanishads, we do have a constant list of important female characters, of sages, of rishis. Thinking of Gargi and her really philosophical penetrating into the nature of the universe with Yajnavalkya.
Yeah.
And then on to the epics and Puranas, and Parvati's tapas as a tapasvini, and so will that be something that students will get exposed to in the course?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm really interested in doing that because that's about the sort of refracting the gaze, changing the gaze, kind of looking at the women, foregrounding women and their practices. Of course, we have to look at stuff like the pravriti and the nivriti paths. So pravriti is, those who are turned towards social duties and social lives, and nivriti being those who are turned away from society, so renounce society in order to achieve spiritual accomplishments. But of course, you can achieve spiritual accomplishments within the pravriti path, and that has traditionally, or at least according to the law texts, the Manavadharma Shastra and texts like that, has been considered to be the appropriate path for women. So we're going to pull apart those sorts of things, and then look at key women who sort of embody some of these quite complex narratives, and the ways in which their stories are told are exposing lots of different views and opinions about them. It's not like the law texts are correct, women are not allowed to renounce. It's much more complex and exciting than that. So, for example, Lopamudra is a character who appears in the Rig Veda, and she, through sex with her husband, acquires his powers. So it's really interesting if you start to look at that as a trope, as for the transfer of spiritual power. And if we broaden the idea of yoga from hatha yoga, and we look at tapas as well, which I think Jacqueline Hargreaves used the phrase in something she wrote the other day, sort of saying the historical line between tapas and hatha or yoga is just absolutely paper thin. So if we broaden our definitions a little bit and look at tapas, then gosh, there's so much we can see. So yes, and Sulabha, characters like that, and I think possibly my favorite is Gandhari. From the Mahabharata. Yeah, so it's about looking at these sort of characters, and then looking at the figure of, say, Lal Ded a little bit later. Definitely considered to be a very accomplished yogini, coming from a tantric approach.
And she's I'm glad we're bringing up Lal Ded or Lala. She's known by a number of names, because she's at least in the materials that survive that are attributed to her. There's always an issue with these poets or poetesses in her case. When there's a wide range of poems and literature attributed, it's hard to know if they were all written by the same author, right? But nonetheless, we have a pretty substantial corpus, and rare in the fact that that are actually from the female voice, right? And she has a lot of really interesting yogic themes in her poetry.
Yeah. So I find this question really interesting, and I was speaking with some students a while back, and they were sort of disappointed that the poems of Lal Ded might not have been written by her. Um, and sort of wanted this really pure sort of line of transmission. But I find that fascinating that there is going to be a composite number of voices contributing to this canon that is attributed to Lal Ded. And what does that tell you? That it tells you that these teachings were seen as being okay for a woman, a powerful renunciate woman, to be teaching.
They're made authoritative by giving them the female voice, which is not typically so.
Yeah,
that does say something about the reception, history, and how people remember her.
Yeah. I mean, something that I'm doing at the moment that I shouldn't be doing, because I should be working on the Haṭha corpus, is looking at Parvati, her asceticism in Kavya, in the Kumara Sambhava.
Oh, some rich, vivid descriptions.
Yeah, but so I mean, yeah. So you can make the argument, as people, the slightly outrageous argument, that Parvati is the heroine of the Kumara Sambhava, which I think Gary Tubb has done.
Tell us a little bit more about that. I mean, most of our listeners, might not be aware of what the
So
Kumara Sambhava is.
Kalidasa is like the if we have to relate this to the West, then he's the Shakespeare, perhaps, of Sanskrit literature. The Kumara Sambhava is the birth of Kumara, and it tells the tale of Shiva and Parvati, and Parvati winning the affections of Shiva, which culminates in lots of lovemaking and eventually the birth of Kumara. And there's one in Canto 5 in the 5th chapter. It describes in the first half Parvati's asceticism, which she undertakes in order to win the heart of Shiva. So quite a lot of sort of, I guess, kind of mundane, that's not the right word, but quite a lot of forms of tapas that she undertakes are quite familiar in the sort of trope of tapasic practices, like standing in a river, these wearing birch bark, limiting her food intake, taking these very strong vows. And one of the reasons that I wanted to look at it is because she is quite eroticized as well. She's presented as this terribly beautiful figure. So you've got this you've got this contrast of asceticism and austerity and renunciation, which she is undertaking in order to win the love of her beloved. So
conflicting moksha and dharma goals, it would seem.
Yeah, it's the rasa, the asceticism of divine love, of you can start to talk about kind of bhakti from.
Is there a translation of the Kumara Sambhava that you'd recommend for folks who just want to read a bit of that, of some Kalidasa?
Well, actually, I just treated myself to the Clay Sanskrit Library version by David Smith, but I haven't read it yet. It only came in the post yesterday. But yeah, the Clay Sanskrit Library is a series of translations of Sanskrit texts, so you can try that one.
That's always a good, reliable series.
Yeah, so you were sort of saying, what did I want to do with the course? So it's a kind of thematic course looking at things like pravriti and nivritti dharma, and then within each module it'll be foregrounding particular figures from particular female figures, where we can look at some of the practices they're undertaking and how they're presented as well. So how are Parvati's penances presented in this quite eroticized way? And we can ask the same sort of questions when we look at images of yoginis as well. And it's important to ask questions like, are these the products of male fantasy? Is this a fetishization of the divine feminine, and there are some absolutely beautiful productions that would have been circulated at court. Or are these more kind of historical? Are these images playing a historical documenting role? Can we say, okay, so this sort of attire was definitely in circulation, but I mean, and of course, these sources can be doing both those things.
Right. It's important to ask that. I found there's much more paintings of female practitioners than there are references, at least in the Haṭha texts again. I mean, we shouldn't, I don't think we should limit ourselves so exclusively to this so-called Haṭha corpus, but if we're looking for sources of, Haṭha or physical yoga that are codified, well, that's where we have to look. But there does seem to be quite a bit of these paintings, particularly during the Mughal era, under the Mughal court, and often depicting a female ascetic, maybe doing a particular penance, standing, using the kind of swing to rest the arms in a standing posture, or seated with a yoga pata, a yoga strap. It is interesting that when we see the male practitioners there, and they're painted in great detail, there's less questioning of whether this is descriptive. The mind, the tendency is to say, oh, this is descriptive. This is a painting and a rendition of real yogis. And yet the question arises, well, with these female ones, now it's being asked, well, is this real, or is this just sort of the male fantasy?
I think we do need to ask those questions because, like, because we've asked those questions of the textual sources. We've said, what is the production, dissemination, history of these texts? What is their audience? So I think we do also need to ask those questions for other art forms as well. I think it is a valid question, but I think that there is a potential conflict around sort of exposing material that relates to women to a different standard of analysis than we're exposing men to. But this is it is a patriarchal society that we're examining here, and that just presents problems or issues for the researcher or the historian, because it's so tempting to bring our own judgments and viewpoints into it, to sort of cast back our present day views and ask this material to conform to a set of values that are not perhaps relevant to it.
Right. But if we do take those paintings as being representative of a social reality, it does expand our archive of evidence beyond the texts, I think, quite a bit, and perhaps complement the texts quite a bit. So we'll be looking at some of those intriguing paintings, I'm sure, in the course, and asking these important questions. Moving forward in the course, as we move through the first few modules, as we get towards the end of the course, will we also be looking ahead towards modern yoga and looking at, kind of where we started at the beginning of, we have this huge dichotomy in the demographic of practitioners. So will we be connecting the dots a bit between sort of the pre-modern and modern yoga traditions, and looking at this rising, surging role of women and female practitioners with global yoga today?
We'll do a little bit of this, the globalization of yoga in the last 200-300 years, and again look at it thematically and anecdotally. So I'd like to look at feminism, neoliberalism, like body politics. There's issues around appropriation to talk about, power dynamics, structural power dynamics, and of course abuse within contemporary yoga. Some of the female characters that I'd like to look at include Helena Blavatsky, Genevieve Stibbons, Molly Baggett-Stack, of course Indra Devi. Suzanne Newcomb has been doing great work on Yogini Sunita. So kind of using these, looking at these lives to see how that can nuance our picture of why women are practicing, how women are practicing, and what are the objectives, what are the kind of social, historical, cultural concerns that yoga practice is responding to.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating, timely, and really really important, especially once we've had this fuller and more in-depth kind of history to kind of situate the contemporary period within. I think that will be really really fascinating to explore, and I'm excited for the course and to have you on Yogic Studies to get to kind of enter into that conversation and in this great detail, because I think it's often the case that, you know, this question of yoga and women or female practitioners, it's something that's sort of constantly referenced, you know, on the
Mm,
periphery, right? But
mm,
it really needs its own space to tackle what is a very big and
mm.
complex topic in this kind of depth, to ask these sensitive questions about our materials, about their audience and composition.
Yeah, I think this is a bit of a, it is a bit of a revisionist history. It's saying, right, okay, let's do something real different. Let's absolutely foreground the lives of women. And I hope, and I'm sure that actually many people are already working on so many elements of this type of research. So yeah, I'm going to be pulling together the threads that I've got so far, and I hope that this area of research is going to be extended upon as we go forward, so that it's not, so that we don't have to have a course that's looking at the history of women in yoga, because it will be more centered anyway.
Yeah, I've always remembered this line from, I think, Wendy Doniger. You know, she was writing about, you know, female voices or references to women in the Dharma Shastras, and you know, there's
Mm,
these sort of horrific lines in the, you know, law literature that say things like, you know, if a woman is to hear the Vedas, then they're to have oil poured in their ears, right? And it's this quite shocking, you know, statement, and you can think, oh, how
mm,
horrific. But you know, Doniger sort of reads that as to say, well, if this text has to say that, then there were women who were hearing
mm,
and learning the Veda, you know.
yeah.
And I've, you know, so if we locate that with, you know, acknowledging this very patriarchal and often misogynistic um, textual landscape that these references occur in, we can sort of excavate these references to women and female voices and bodies, and hopefully, you know, learn more. Like, don't not just reading that verse and then moving on, but trying to think more carefully about, you know, what might be behind a statement like that. And I've always felt that that was the case with these Haṭha references
Mm,
to women in these Vajroli sections, that you know, although it's a fleeting reference, if it's suggesting that there are these female practitioners who are adepts in Hatha yoga, and then it sort of just moves on, well, that's likely just the tip of the iceberg. You know,
mm,
that's not the focus of this text. That's not what we're getting. But those references are important and need to be, you know, further excavated. So
mm.
I'm just happy that you're doing this work. I think the time is ripe now, especially sort of at the end of this Hatha yoga project, and as we have more critical editions and good translations where you can do this more synoptic, you know, and kind of surveys and thematic work
Mm.
across these texts, I think it's a really important time to be kind of looking more broadly.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, I think we're kind of at the end of our time here, and you know, there's so much more to discuss and to think through along these lines. But hopefully, we've kind of given a good preview to your important research and to the upcoming online course on women in yoga that you'll be teaching on October 5th through 30th. We really invite listeners and anybody who's interested to learn more and to study these topics with Ruth to join us. As we wind down here, Ruth, is there anything else that you wanted to touch on today, or anything else you'd like to say in closing about any of this work or the course?
So I had a thought this morning. And I had this fantastic metaphor because I'd listened to your other podcasts. I was like, right, Seth's going to ask this question. And it was all about this pumpkin plant in my garden. And I'm not, and then the beauty of the metaphor completely left me. And I can't remember why the pumpkin plant is so important, but it was something about the pumpkin. This pumpkin, I didn't mean to plant it. I meant to plant something completely different. Anyway, it's taken over and it's been like this dragon that's just kind of moved out through the whole garden, and it's got this huge pumpkin coming out, which I have no idea when it's ripe enough to take off.
Wow. Well, you didn't plant a pumpkin seed, but you yielded a pumpkin?
Yeah. I meant to plant sunflowers, man. Ain't got no sunflowers. Well, I've got one, but not what I wanted.
Well, that's kind of magical.
And it was something about like in I think the metaphor was something about in scholarly research, we're sort of dissecting and we're compartmentalizing and we're stereotyping and we're trying to make sense and we're trying to make a narrative that flows. And it's beautiful work. It's really it's fun in so many ways, but it also we can sort of forget to see the whole sometimes and forget to just enjoy our practices. And I sort of see scholarship as a practice in many ways, as of course is more physical practices and meditative practices. So I think that it was like letting the pumpkin just take over and just observing the beauty of this and the fruit that it delivers. And I haven't been able to access that part of the garden at all and sort it out and get the weeds out or anything. But it's like a decentering of the ego and a decentering of the kind of actor who wants to get in there and make it about them, like this research is about me or I'm going to discover something. It's just sort of watching the beauty of it all unfold.
Well, may your dissertation research be a beautiful flourishing of pumpkins.
No, well, the problem is it's at the moment it's a big organic mess that I can't enter.
Yes.
And all of your other podcast contributors have been like, well, yes, they finished their PhDs and, you know.
Hey,
So
you're talking to somebody who's been dragging their dissertation feet for years. So you'll probably end up finishing before me when all said and done. So,
well, at the moment, mine is this like organic, crazy pumpkin garden that yes. Anyway, we'll get somewhere with it.
I know the feeling. And a messy metaphor is very apt for the process of a dissertation and this
Don't
research.
Tell my supervisors.
I won't. Don't worry. They're not listening.
They're not going to listen.
No. All right, Ruth. Well, this was great. And again, we're excited for your course. And thanks so much. And let's be in touch, okay?
Thanks so much for inviting me to be a part of this. Cheers, Seth.
All right. Cheers. Thanks for listening to the Yogic Studies podcast. If you've enjoyed this conversation and would like to support the show, please consider leaving us a positive review and rating on iTunes. As always, we are grateful for your support. Thanks so much, everyone, and please take care.